In this next video from War, Art and Visual Culture Sydney, Professor Joanna Bourke from Birkbeck University, London, chairs a session with the artist Baptist Coelho, Georgia Vesma from the University of Manchester, and Alice Evans from the Australian War Memorial. I hope you enjoy this video.
Okay, we are in for a real treat. We've got three things happening in this session. The first, after the first person, we've got two people who are going to be giving talks. But the first person on our agenda for this session is Baptist Coelho, who is an artist, a performance artist. So we are going to have a performance for the next 20 minutes. Two things, though, I've been asked to say. Could you please, if you want to leave, to go to the loo or to get a drink, do it now, don't come back. Don't want people to leave halfway during the performance. And please, no photography for this performance. So we have Baptist Coelho, who is an artist, and he's going to do a performance. They agreed to eat biscuits and European bread, but our regiment refused. Indian Soldiers' Letters, 1914 to 1918. Thank you very much.
But don't you think? Why? When? Yes. मैं कहाँ पर हूँ? Why?
Pearl. And I'll tell you all that there is to know about Pearl, which is not much. I'm expanding upon my master's research on Pearl and the mapping of his trench art collection, and I'm currently working as an assistant curator at the Australian War Memorial, where I've worked with mapping databases. Pearl was 21 years of age and a joiner by trade when he enlisted at Ormstone, Tasmania on the 9th of November 1915. He travelled from Sydney to Alexandria aboard the HMAT Orsoda in March 1916 and was on the battlefields of France by August as a sapper with the Australian 5th Field Company Engineers. He remained there following the armistice and into 1919. Pearl returned to Australia in March of that year and relocated to Canberra, where he gained employment at the Australian War Memorial as an installation officer, that was as a tradesman and working in carpentry, as is specified in the electoral rolls and in his staff files. And this is as much as anyone knows, besides the dates of birth and death in 1893 and 1986 respectively. There is no evidence to suggest that he is survived by anyone, and nor can any photographs of him be traced. He is an enigma, but his trench art collection, as I'm going to discuss, strips back this mystery. It is Pearl's phenomenal trench art collection, produced between 1916 and 1919, that is of interest today as a catalyst for my bringing Pearl's service to light to help you visualise and further contextualise his wartime experiences. His collection is a refined amalgamation of well-crafted pieces that sees used, souvenired war materials, including military shell cases, other parts of shells, badges and buttons, reassembled into everyday objects, such as a map of Tasmania, chrysanthemum vase, a clock, and a hat pin stand. 16 objects, all that he is known to have produced, are held in the military heraldry collection of the Australian War Memorial. It is the field notes that make the work of Sapper Pearl exceptional, as this is a feature not typically associated with First World War trench art. The field notes act as a means through which to interrogate material culture and digital art history, two methodologies that have informed my paper. They are largely complementary methodologies in my cross-disciplinary analysis, and yet I argue today that material culture only allows for so much analysis and a certain level of understanding of trench art before a need to turn to digital art history. Maps are a useful visual aid for my interrogation of both methodologies. I'm not suggesting that material culture lacks relevance in a need to turn to digital art history. I'm merely highlighting that an application of it must be approached wisely and without too narrow a focus. My research is framed by the following working definitions of material culture, trench art, and digital art history, as can be seen on the slide here. The study of material culture created in periods of conflict often reflects a revision of the facets of society as included in Brown's definition. The definition remains the same, yet the material culture lens enables us as art historians to see changes in these values and attitudes because of the subjecting of individuals and societies to the reality and barbarity of war. Secondly, trench art, as associated temporally and spatially with conflict, complements the language of digital art history. And lastly, digital art history, as defined in my own terms, forces us to ask new questions of objects. You can see how each of these complementary definitions propel my research into an interdisciplinary combination of art history, history more broadly, anthropology, and even archaeology, which is beyond scope of my discussion today. Now to my mapping process. I have here again the example of Pearl's trench art clock with his field notes alongside. I've highlighted when Pearl refers to a location. Pearl notes that he produced the object in Ypres, so I have plotted Ypres on my map. His next statement of significance in terms of provenance is that the case was made from two 4.5-inch shell cases picked up on Christmas Day 1917 at the Australian batteries at La Gazette, so I plotted this on the same map. Lastly, he notes, the rising sun is a badge of a mate killed at Norriel, and that became the third and final point of provenance to add to my map. I then repeated this exercise with each of Pearl's trench art objects, drawing out all information to do with provenance and plotting them on a map, which I'll show in a minute. The translation of Pearl's trench art to a digital platform can be viewed as a small micro set of data when compared to the broader context of the plethora of First World War trench art. An advantage of being able to apply digital art history to Pearl's trench art collection is that it is a workable and complete set of useful data. At the same time, this, together with the accompanying field notes, provide justifications for my selection of Pearl's trench art as a suitable example for such a methodological study. My plotting of the locations in which Pearl souvenired materials and assembled his objects constitutes the metadata. There's an easy transition then between, as Pearl's work gains traction digitally, adopting the language of and developing into data and metadata. The exercise of mapping Pearl's field notes reveals the great potential and associated challenges of digital art history. It's prompted new questions of the objects. It raises patterns, relationships, clusters and outliers, again re-emphasising this ease in methodological shift. Another strength of digital platforms such as this is that they allow for the analysis of a large volume of data which would be incomprehensible without some form of aid or prompt. And I'll present to you my findings and some answers today. And so much of the experimentation that's interesting to do with digital art history is finding the right tools. And before I show you what did work, I'd like to show you what didn't work. So I have here a database called StoryMap. And I have the example, an initial engagement with StoryMap assists in beginning, Initial engagement with StoryMap assists in beginning to visualise these spatial coordinates. I've mapped the location from which each piece of material was souvenired, together with that where Pearl noted that he produced the objects. I repeated this with 5 of Pearl's pieces before finding that the database itself was becoming increasingly awkward to use as more metadata was added. As you can see, the zooming capabilities are limited, and therefore getting an overall idea of the relationship between the objects is challenging. It provides a great entry into an engagement with digital art history, yet calls for further experimentation with other databases. There's a plethora of available databases, making the selection process difficult, but I would like to show you a tool that has worked. So this is Google Mind Maps, and the teardrop shaped points here represent the locations where Pearl acquired the materials, whilst the starred points signify the locations in which Pearl produced the objects. Each colour corresponds to a different object. Clusters have formed where the objects are primarily assembled in Ypres at the top there, and the Somme, Ypres in Belgium and the Somme in France. Consequently, we can theorise that Pearl stops for longer periods in these two locations to produce objects, despite him not documenting this. The map makes it easier to determine the movement of Pearl himself and the distances that he covered in souveniring the materials on the way to assembling them as objects. One useful feature of this platform is the lines that can be plotted between points, which calculate the number of kilometres covered. And I'll show you the example here of the napkin ring. So you can see here I've plotted the napkin ring, and that's where Pearl assembles it in Montier in France. But in showing you the feature, which is the kilometres covered, you can see that approximately, again 62 kilometres away, is where he souvenirs the ring for the napkin ring, and then approximately 92 kilometres away he souvenirs the feet and the stand for the napkin ring. In saying this, however, straight lines such as these will only ever be approximate, in a wartime context especially, and not necessarily reflective of the actual path taken by Pearl. Space, mobility, exchange, bricolage, and recyclia. You can see how anthropology informs my analysis of trench art. Pearl's trench art, I argue, is in fact a stronger example of bricolage, that is, the assemblage of a variety of materials into a different object, rather than recyclia, which is purely the recycling or reuse of material. Particularly because of bricolage's concern with evaluative material potential anew. Mobility prompts an assessment of an object's lives from a material culture perspective, which demonstrates material culture and anthropology as complementary. The plotted locations also speak to the pre-life of the material, a deduction that in fact stems from material culture. That is, the visual aid becomes a more comprehensive way of recognising the longer genesis of materials before Pearl acquires them and reconfigures them into trench art. We can more easily trace a journey whereby a piece of copper conductor, for instance, is collected with other materials and transformed into the floral stalk of a hatpin stand, which I'll show you here. So this is a zoomed in image of the floral stalk of the hatpin stand, the copper conductor. If I take you a bit closer. It then travels approximately, again, 15 kilometres to the Somme. Just as another great example that I've come across in doing this plotting is Fleur, where Pearl collects or reconfigures parts of a German water bottle into the wings and tail of a model of a German Taube aircraft, and he assembles that again in the Somme, and that I found to be approximately 46 kilometres away. The beginnings of such visual analyses are well suited to the eye of an art historian, especially one with an understanding of the relevance of material culture. Several challenges presented themselves during the construction of this map that were often attributed to the level of information or lack thereof included in Pearl's field notes. The plotted locations of the metadata more often reflect a general vicinity rather than a precise point of reference. Pearl often only detailed that objects were constructed on the Somme or made at Ypres before unpacking the significance of their materials, as is the case for the hatpin stand and the clock, respectively. As several objects were produced in the same areas, hence the clustering, a consideration had to be made in aesthetically mapping these plotted points of reference so as not to make them disappear behind one another, especially given the effectiveness of the zooming feature of the starbase. Further, the level of details in the field notes meant that there was only ever going to be a certain level of metadata produced. That is, several materials were mentioned by Pearl that were not associated with provenance, and so don't appear on the map. An engagement with digital art history prompted further research and questions in constructing such historical cartography. Certain locations, such as Needle Dump, for instance, I have here, that Pearl referred to in the life of an 18-pounder battery as part of his inkstand required an investigation into the broader context of the First World War in order to establish its precise location. Needle Dump was a location of trench warfare in Les Boues in France, which today a cemetery commemorates. Pearl's noting of locations often required more research than being able to place them immediately on this map. This was evidenced too in the small ambiguities in the spellings of locations. Longat, for instance, did not appear to be traceable on a map when plotting it as metadata for Pearl's kitchen scoop. The database recognised Rue de Longat, but as Pearl did not specify a street, the decision was made to plot it at Langat, which I will show you here. But as you can see, when I zoom out, you can see just the extent to which Langat appears as an outlier. And there's a possibility then that this could be the incorrect location, but that then prompts further questions in the translation of Pearl's field notes into metadata. In addition, the accompaniment of a timeline feature reinforces an understanding of Pearl's rapid production of trench art between 1916 and 1919. So if you watch as I turn the year-by-year layers on, you get a sense of the extent to which Pearl starts producing and assembling these objects in and around the Somme and Ypres, and particularly in 1918, just how close in proximity to these wartime microcosms or centres this data starts to appear, these trench art objects start to be assembled. Plotting of the Rose Bowl was particularly interesting for this reason, and I'd just like to show you a close-up image of it here. So that's the Rose Bowl there. And if I take you back to the map and turn off all of the other year-by-year layers except for the Rose Bowl, you can see just how close in proximity Pearl souvenirs these materials, the teardrop shape points, and takes them to the Somme, the star shape point. So he collects both the buttons that encase the bowl from 2 locations, alongside the bowl itself, and the stand and the feet, and then the rising sun badge as well. And from no more than 54 kilometres away this is occurring, so from Cartigny in France, he collects or souvenirs the telephone wire grid. Whilst not dismissing the challenges that have been discussed, I argue there to be an accessibility of the digital humanities rather than an inherent intimidation, especially with regards to mapping. I've demonstrated an example of the relative ease with which an art historian can engage with the digital humanities and contribute metadata to a map without any prior training. Let's go back to my PowerPoint slide. There's the potential for further development of a project like that of Sapper collection to the digital humanities too. There's an advantage of being able to become more familiar with using base maps in order to overlay First World War trench maps with contemporary Google Maps. These 2 slides here give a sense of the preparatory stages of this process. An introduction of trench maps in fact reveals the embedded nature of material culture in informing the digital humanities, particularly in theorising just how easily the shrapnel of war moved between the dead, the living, the hands of one's comrades, as you can see mapped in the blue lines here, and the hands of the enemy in the red map lines. Mirrored screenshots, as I'll show you again, depict the movement of 4.5-inch shell cases and a rising sun badge from Le Bizet and L'Oreal respectively, the bottom 2 images, in assembling Pearl's trench heart clock in the Somme, the top image. May 1918 and September 1917, of which 2 of these trench maps are dated, the bottom 2, are the closest maps documented to when Pearl made significant statements about producing the clock at Ypres and acquiring the 4.5-inch shell cases from Le Bizet respectively. As Pearl did not detail the date of collection of the rising sun badge from L'Oreal, I have included a map dated closest to that of the construction of the clock in Ypres. The application of this metadata into a database like MapWarper, so as to geo-rectify these maps and engage with this overlaying process, is beyond the scope of this project, but this is one avenue through which it could develop further. The scope of this project reveals an obvious yet noteworthy point of the noteworthy challenge, of the time-consuming nature of digital art history. Pearl's collection takes on many more lives as I think about possibilities for future research. I've plotted here the small coastal town of Ulverstone in northern Tasmania, where Pearl enlisted in 1915, and linked it with the plotted battlefields of France and Belgium. Yet what happens in the other direction is an interesting conundrum. What would the mapping of Pearl's trench heart look like if we follow the paths of the objects returning to Australia post-war? Some of his collection gains further lives as it goes on display at the Australian War Memorial and in other exhibitions, such as the Art Gallery of South Australia's recent Sappers and Shrapnel exhibition, for instance, which displayed several of Pearl's pieces and was the first time that Pearl's pieces were exhibited outside of the War Memorial. And as I think about news for future research, I've been able to take away a key point from this exercise, which in fact leaves me with further questions. I said at the beginning that not much is known about Pearl, yet it turns out that this is not his story, it is the story of the objects. This exercise tracks the objects and the materials themselves. In telling their own stories of the war then, these objects in fact reveal a greater narrative of the First World War. The social lives of Pearl's trench heart objects somewhat stand in for, in the best sense of the word, those that are mute. It is this appreciation which intensifies with an engagement with digital art history. The context of war speaks precisely to the notion that the construction of trench art draws upon available materials. War, in fact, scales back this idea in the limited materials that are available, and yet I have learned so much. It is a newfound appreciation for the inherent craftsmanship of an engineer and the skills of a proud Tasmanian. The application of Pearl's collection, again, to the digital sphere, deepens the extent to which Pearl is revealing a narrative of the enemy as much as of his comrades. Note the hole in what is a belt buckle in this close-up image of Pearl's map of Tasmania. The buckle belonged to a German officer shot whilst on patrol near Hoopling in France. The whole Pearl notes was made by the bullet that killed him. Mapping locations such as Hoopling reveals the trench lines becoming evidently closer and the exchange of shrapnel between the hands of one's comrades, the enemy, the dead and the living becoming that much more apparent. This is something that we are able to gauge in a much more holistic sense from digital art history and mapping, rather than purely appreciating the reconfiguration of materials into items such as the map of Tasmania. This digital realm, therefore, enriches not only my interpretation of Pearl's trench art, but also our understanding of the phenomenal lives of these materials. Thank you.
Most of you will have noticed that the title on the screen is pretty different from the title that Joanna just gave. I wrote the proposal for this when I was halfway through my Masters, so it has changed a lot. So today I'm going to be talking about the photographs from Katrina Leroy's Uphill Escape on the Marines, which is the title it was given when it was, this series of photographs was published in Life magazine. Katrina Leroy arrived in Vietnam in 1966, aged 21, with $200, no return ticket, one Leica camera, and no photojournalistic experience. Over the next 3 years, she would make a combat parachute jump, sustain a shrapnel injury, survive capture by the North Vietnamese army, and produce hundreds of images of the Vietnam War. Her photographs from Vietnam won awards and were published in Life and Paris Match magazines, among others. Leroy's life and work characterised by the challenging boundaries between civilian and competent, journalist and subject, enemy and friend. Susan Jeffords argues that Vietnam narratives blurred the boundaries of relationships of difference, collapsing seemingly dichotomous categories into one another, with the exception of the line between the masculine and the feminine, which she argues remained firm and unwavering. Ervin challenges this assertion, arguing that wartime offered a utopian possibility previously unimagined by American men of non-restrictive gender roles, a possibility which allowed for new configurations of masculinity encompassing the life of the body, the expression of emotion, the acceptance and provision of nurturance, values conventionally associated, he says, with the feminine. These values are present in Leroy's depictions of soldiers in Vietnam. Though Leroy described herself as anti-war, she expressed sympathy for American soldiers and saw as their brothers. Even after leaving Vietnam, she refused to criticise the behaviour of American soldiers. So I'm going to be examining how Leroy, as a female war photographer, engaged with and framed the boundaries of the masculine in the context of violent conflict in order to communicate her personal opinions on the Vietnam War and those who fought it. Leroy's images challenge traditional formulations of masculinity. This paper will use a single series of 6 photographs to explore the extent to which Leroy used unusual representations of American warrior masculinity in support of her anti-war agenda. It will also consider the extent to which she upheld her personal code to preserve the dignity and privacy of her subjects. On May 20th, 1967, Leroy was shooting combat near Contien, south of the demilitarized zone. The day before, Life magazine had run a 6-page feature of her photographs from a battle at Hill 881 on April 29th. Her agency, Associated Press, had also sold these photographs to Paris Match, the Italian magazine Epica, and Time. Horst Fass, her agent at Associated Press, told her she could expect $5,000 for the pictures. Previously, she had been paid just $15 per frame. Hill 881 was a landmark moment in Leroy's career as she experienced widespread success for the first time. At Contien, she experienced a second landmark event when, in her words, she took a couple of pounds of shrapnel in my 85-pound frame. She was treated on the Navy hospital ship Sanctuary. Her agency footed the $540 bill suggests that the recent sale of the Hill 881 images gave Leroy access to increased support from AP as she became a more valuable asset. So in May 1967, then, Leroy went from being a journalist to being the subject of news through her transgressive presence on the battlefield. Time dedicated column inches to praising her as one of the most stubbornly persistent and bull-headed photographers covering the war. And we can see here that actually the image of Leroy is quite a lot bigger than her photographs in the article. Importantly, even in this short column, Time drew comparisons with earlier battles in the East Asian theatre, with the caption at the bottom there, evoking the ghosts of Elon and Porkchop. Coincidentally, it was the female photographer, Dickie Chappelle, who was one of the first photographers to shoot Iwo Jima after its capture. The boundary between civilian and combatant was weakened for Leroy, evidenced by the claim in Time that she was doing the same thing a Marine was. She was getting ready to storm South Vietnam's Helete 1. This boundary crossing is also present in the narratives of male journalists. Michael Hare, for example, claims that during the Tet Offensive, I wasn't a reporter, I was a shooter. And Tim Page sustained shrapnel injuries shooting combat at Chulai. For a female photographer, this boundary blurring carries a gender component, as she joined the masculine ranks of what Patricia Becker calls photographer heroes, ready to risk their lives to get the most intense images of combat. Leroy already presented herself as a soldier. She dressed in fatigues and army boots, she carried rations, and she slept in holes while in the field. Robert Hamilton, discussing representations of male photojournalists in Vietnam, claims that the adoption of this military style was an act of identity blurring. The journalists and the grunts would collapse into one another. Their situation vis-à-vis the war is identical. As Leroy's experience of the battlefield, including her wounding, represents a challenge to gendered expectations, so too her photographs of Marines from these battles also challenge expectations of the male warrior. Marta Zarzeka argues that the persistence of masculine impermeability is a cultural assumption underlying conflict. This impermeability implies not only preservation of bodily wholeness, but also a kind of emotional impermeability, a resistance to fear. In 2005, Leroy edited and published a photo book which placed her photographs alongside those of Don McCullin, Larry Burroughs, and Gilles Caron. The introduction, written by then Senator John McCain, emphasizes the pain, stark terror, and importantly, the love and compassion of combatants and victims. This love and compassion is foregrounded alongside physical wounding in these photographs. In a 1985 interview, Leroy claimed that she avoided depicting dead Marines who could be recognized out of respect for the privacy of her subjects. The images we're going to look at today necessarily engage with wounding and death, and we will consider whether she was successful in protecting privacy in her images from Helete 1. Helete 1 North formed part of the hill fights that took place to retain control of Khe Sanh Valley, of tactical importance for the protection of nearby Khe Sanh combat base. And 6 photographs from this battle would become the most widely circulated images that Leroy produced in Vietnam. And they were presented by Life magazine like this. So this was the centerfold spread of a 6-page article, which also included some of her photographs on the page before and the page afterwards. I would suggest that the widespread publication of these images could be attributed to the successful capture of what Henri Cartier-Bresson calls the decisive moment, which brings together artistic compositional qualities with a sense of the significance of an event in a fraction of a second. Leroy herself described these images as timeless. This sequence captures with precision a series of moments that together tell a powerful story. By the late 1960s, Life magazine was known for publishing images of war. It had first obtained permission to show dead American soldiers in 1944 and built a reputation on its claim that war is unpleasant, cruel, and inhuman. It is more dangerous to forget this than to be shocked by reminders. It is therefore significant that Life was the only publication to run the full 6-photograph sequence. These images formed the central spread of the story about the battle for Helete 1 with the following caption. At the height of the battle for 881 North, the Navy medical corpsman, 19-year-old Vernon White of Phoenix, Arizona, has reached a fellow Marine. Helmet off, White applies the compress to the Marine's chest and listens in vain for a heartbeat. In the large picture, he realizes the Marine's dead. Then, still under fire from 2 sides, he lunges away to reach another wounded man. So this caption emphasizes the risk that White takes to treat his comrade. The dead man is a fellow Marine. Providing medical care on the battlefield is established as an act of courageous heroism motivated by brotherhood. Jeffords notes that one of the most frequently celebrated acts of the war was of men who sacrificed or risked their lives to save other men during battle. To take this risk was a profound expression of the masculine bond formed in wartime. This bond crossed barriers of racial, ethnic, class, age, geographic, religious or social differences, serving to confirm the shared masculinity of soldiers rather than their differences. Because the bond was situated within masculine identity, Jeffords also argues that journalists such as Hare were able to participate, becoming intimate with soldiers through shared experience. Leroy returned the photograph White twice in his life. In 2005, she and a journalist visited him in his home in Arizona for the Paris match and asked him to reminisce on the photograph. In the article, White recounts the story as he recalls it. Leroy had been on his left, her camera perched between two branches, and as he leaned over the man who he refers to as Rock, he heard Rock die, took his M16 and reloaded it. Around him, he could hear voices telling him that someone named Jay was down and needed his help. At this point in the story, Leroy chimes in that she had witnessed White assaulting the hill screaming. The two reminisce together as individuals who experienced the same moment. This almost suggests that Leroy is able on some level to access this bond that supposedly, according to Jeffords, male journalists experienced with their subjects. White's reaction to the photographs themselves is expressed in emotional terms in the Paris match interview. He associates the image with 30 years of insomnia, 4 failed marriages, long-lasting disability and post-traumatic stress. He recognises that through this image he became an icon of the war from which he never recovered. The bond expressed in the Hill 881 images is one of emotional, compassionate care at the moment of death. Santanu Das, considering the trenches of World War I, identifies that the norms of tactile contact between men changed profoundly. Constant proximity to death and wounding dissolved boundaries and allowed for feminine expressions of care between men. This collapsing of boundaries is also apparent in White's demonstrations for the dead Marine, which are represented as at once heroic and tender. White cradles the dead Marine's head tenderly, his eyes are lowered and his eyebrows set in a clear show of emotion. This image of White listening for a heartbeat with his eyes closed is equally an image of an embrace. His actions represent an act of resistance against horror. The tenderness of the moment pierces the surface of the image, communicating a sense of powerful emotion. These images express the emotional aspect of the masculine bond, and its expression through touch and the breakdown of boundaries between male bodies. This image differs from the others in the sequence, because the wounded Marine's face is visible. White still wears his helmet. Later in the sequence, his helmet protects the other man from Leroy's camera, performing a different protective form of kind of protective action from how it would usually perform. This is an example of a case where Leroy has not lived up to her self-imposed standard for protecting the privacy of dead Marines, something she said he would never show a dead man where he could be identified by his face, but there he is. Life is the only publication that chose to run with this image, and they still chose to print it smaller than any of the others in the centerfold. This image, by contrast, was chosen as the largest of the spread. It purports to show the moment that White realises the Marine is dead. 40 years later in the Paris match interview, White describes that he realised that when he heard the man's heartbeat grow weaker, so actually the previous image where he was listening for the heartbeat is the moment of realisation. In the photograph, White lifts his head from the dead Marine's chest with an anguished expression. In his grief, he is shown to be permeable, not inured to the horror of battle, but vulnerable to it. Simultaneously, the photograph permeates the viewer in a moment of artsy and punctum, produced by White's visible emotion. Zarzika argues that for Western audiences, photographs of mourning and grief typically depict women, that it is the female body that molds the viewer's identification with the mourning subject. Depicting an American soldier's grief, this image challenges a gendered construction of visible mourning. Reader responses to the Life article, published 2 weeks later, show that viewers were able to identify with mourning as expressed through the male body. Henry Stringham in Yuma, Arizona, compares the article to one published by Life in 1950 about the battle for No Name Bridge in Korea. So here again we see a comparison with the Korean War, just like in the time caption. This early in the Vietnam conflict, before the Tet Offensive, the comparison may have seemed apt. The article in question, which is reproduced here, features an image of a group of Marines in the foreground resting up after combat. Behind them, 5 Marines carry a wounded sick over the crest of the hill. Stringham, referring to both the Korea and the Hill 881 articles, comments that courageous actions such as these are typical of the down leathernecks, the Marines. The comparison situates White's experience within the context of courageous actions that Stringham associates with the American Marines. The common factor is resilience, the ability of the leathernecks to persevere even after an exhausting battle. White's visible emotion does not exclude him from this traditionally masculine discourse, because the photographs also demonstrate his resilience as he lunges away to help another man. Second response from Henry Camilletti of New York responds more directly to the emotional content of the images. How tragic to lose these fine boys, thousands of miles from home, for a doubtful cause that has created internal ill will. Nicholas Hopkinson observes that the most effective argument against war is to show the cost to the audience's compatriots. Camilletti's response suggests that Leroy's depiction of White's mourning successfully mobilized audience sympathies for American soldiers, at least among the typically anti-war audience of Life magazine. Emphasizing White's vulnerability in youth communicates an anti-war perspective that remains sympathetic to individual soldiers. That Life published a response which criticizes the war as doubtful while preserving the image of soldiers as fine boys suggests this is an audience reaction that the editors expected. Portrayals of grief come at the cost of the subject's privacy, as their personal grief becomes public property. And Leroy described receiving letters from American mothers convinced that either of the men depicted in the image was their son. Crucially, this suggests that her stated personal code that she would not photograph dead men who could be identified did not prevent audiences from identifying with the subjects of her photographs. White's personal grief is generalized. He and his fallen comrades stand in for all the fine boys that Camilletti believes formed in his letter. Taken together, Camilletti and Stringham's responses suggest that the depiction of emotion in Leroy's images resonated with American audiences, expressing both vulnerability and resilience. In this way, the images offer a new perspective on warrior masculinity, incorporating the expression of emotions into the performance of courage. With these images then, Leroy aimed to communicate an anti-war message that portrayed the Marine as a sympathetic figure. White is portrayed as a caregiver to the dead Marine. His touch is the focal point of the images, expressing the masculine bond through his acts of intimate care. On realizing that the Marine is dead, White is transformed from caregiver to mourner. His moment of private grief, captured by Leroy's camera and reproduced in the press, becomes an expression of a wider public grief over the death of fine boys for a doubtful cause. The widespread publication of these images in the European and American press suggests that Leroy captured a decisive moment that communicated her anti-war stance while simultaneously mobilizing sympathy for American soldiers. Reader responses suggest that White's apparent resilience situated his grief within the context of leatherneck courage and allowed his emotional expression to stand as an example of the masculine bond. While Leroy was challenging gender boundaries as a stubbornly persistent and bull-headed photographer, she was also capturing images that challenged the unemotional masculine stereotype around the American Marine rescue. Her images of Vernon White and the unnamed Marine on Hill 881 represent the masculine bond in a way which subverts expected signifiers of masculinity. Care, tenderness, and grief are configured through these images as constitutive of courage and resilience in a way that resonated with the anti-war American audience of Life magazine at the time. Thank you.
Can the three people come up to the front here? I'm afraid we only have about 5 minutes for discussion, so if you really want to say something or ask a question, please speak now. We've got 7 minutes. Who would like to start? Yes.
Just a question about how Catherine Leroy came to be appointed. Was she commissioned by Life magazine or?
No, sorry, almost, in fact, all of the female photographers of the Vietnam War were freelancers. So she decided that she wanted to go to Vietnam. The one thing she had was a camera, so she decided that when she got there she'd be a photographer. She turned up at the Associated Press office, asked what kind of work they wanted to see, and then went away and took cameras and took pictures until they started buying them. So she worked for herself.
And did Life then buy the photographs?
Yeah, so they were sold to Life by Associated Press. So Associated Press were her agent at that time. She had a few different agents during her 3 years in Vietnam, but they sort of sold them to a few international publications.
And then are they now in the Life collection, or have Life handed them on to?
They are held by her own archive. So
Oh, okay.
there's a Catherine Leroy archive in Paris.